Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 155. And this time I'm going to talk about Heart's third album from 1977, Little Queen. And this is, in fact, the very first Canadian release of this from 77. This was their first album with Portrait Records after the big fiasco with Mushroom Records, their original label. In my view, it's every bit as good as their debut album and arguably more consistently good. Like all Heart albums from the 1970s, it's very much influenced by Led Zeppelin's light and shade philosophy. They were big fans of Zeppelin. Zeppelin were big fans of them as well. As with Zeppelin, there's a nice mix of heavy rock and delicate folk, but Heart have a distinct sound of their own, led of course by Ann Wilson's crystalline vocals and the virtuosity of a band that was laden with multi-instrumentalists. Heart's origins date to 1967 when Steve Fossen and Roger Fisher formed a band with a couple other guys just north of Seattle, an outfit called the Army, and that was eventually shortened to Heart. After a few years and a few lineup changes, Ann Wilson joined as a singer in and about 1971, and at that point the band changed its name from Heart to Hocus Pocus. It looked like Roger's brother Mike was going to get sent to Vietnam, and so he booted it off to Canada. He came back on a secret visit, met Ann, who had joined the band. They fell in love, and then when he had to go back to Canada, she followed him there. So the band breaks up for a while, but eventually Roger and Steve and a few other folks migrate north to Vancouver, where the band sets up shop again. By 1973-74, Heart was gigging around Vancouver, and at this point Ann Wilson's younger sister, Nancy Wilson, joined on guitar, and she promptly fell in love with Roger Fisher, so the two Wilson sisters were seeing the two Fisher brothers. Mike, of course, wasn't in the band, but he'd been the impetus for the whole group to move to Canada. Roger, of course, was the guitarist. The band had been known as Heart earlier. They had changed to Hocus Pocus, recall, when Ann Wilson joined the band, but now in 1974 they changed the name back to Heart, and the classic lineup is fully complete in 1975 when Mike DeRosier joins on drums, as well as Howard Leese, a session guy they knew in Vancouver who was a keyboardist but also a multi-instrumentalist. The band's reputation is growing rapidly in Vancouver around 74-75, and at this point they recorded a demo using a producer, Mike Flicker, who would go on to produce their first 5 records. They signed to Vancouver's Mushroom Records, which was run by a guy called Shelley Siegel, releasing their debut album in 1975, Dreamboat Annie. It was a bit of a slow burner, but eventually, particularly after they got a gig opening for Rod Stewart at the Montreal Forum, sales began to take off, and eventually, by 1976, Dreamboat Annie had gone to number 7 on Billboard. That's all great, and stardom, here we come, but at this point the band hits a bit of a speed bump. In the midst of recording their follow-up album, Magazine, their label Mushroom puts out an ad in the music press which basically shows both sisters bare-shouldered as they are on the front cover of Dreamboat Annie, with the tagline, "It was only our first time." Soon after, they were asked by an interviewer if they were lovers, and they basically lost their shit, understandably. They were furious with the label, they broke their contract, they signed with another label, Portrait Records, which was a subsidiary of CBS, and began to work on a third album, this one, with Portrait, while Magazine was still unfinished and unreleased. Enter the Lawyers. Through 1976 and 1977, Mushroom Records and Portrait Records were suing each other, trying to prevent the other from releasing new Heart material. Mushroom Records knew that Portrait had this album in the can and wanted to get a jump on them, so they released a rushed version of Magazine, again, the album that was not entirely finished. They stuck a couple live tracks on and pushed it out shortly before this album was to be released. Eventually, a judge in Seattle ruled that Heart were within their rights to break their contract and sign with Portrait Records, but they did still owe Mushroom Records an album. So what happens is the album, which had been rushed out, was recalled. Heart goes back into the studio. They actually had a guard there making sure nobody erased the tapes. They did the overdubs, they did the mix down, and the revised version of Magazine is released in 1978 by Mushroom. It goes to number 17 on Billboard and eventually goes platinum. So this album, Little Queen, is recorded in the midst of all these fraught circumstances between February and April 1977. It's recorded in Seattle at K. Smith Studios. Mike Flicker, as I mentioned, is the producer, and this is a record which has all the greatest elements of 1970s production, an era which I'm particularly fond of. If you want to figure out sight unseen what decade a rock record was made in, just listen to the sound of the drums. Are they tinny and wimpy and in the background? Probably the 60s. Is there a massive snare sound draped in reverb which makes the whole seem kind of both on the one hand dominating and also cold? It's likely the 80s. Is there a nice, crisp, warm sound to the drum which is totally punchy and you can actually feel in your body? It's probably the 70s. So it's a great sounding album, and as I'll mention, it's a great musical album, but it was recorded in the midst of a very tense period because they were told, the band, that they had basically had 3 weeks to get the record done. There was a court hearing coming up, and there was every likelihood the judge would say, cease and desist making any new music until we figured out who owns the rights to the music and all the rest of it. But their lawyers figured if they actually had a record done and in the record stores, most judges would be loath to make them call it back and interfere with their commercial progress and so on. So 3 weeks it was that Mike Flicker had to work with Heart, who were still composed of their classic lineup. And that lineup has Ann Wilson on lead vocals and flute, Her sister Nancy on acoustic, occasionally electric guitars, auto harp, harmonica, mandolin, piano, and vocals, both backup and lead. Roger Fisher on lead guitar and mandolin. Howard Leese on mellotron, lead guitar, acoustic guitar, vocals, piano, mandolin, Selena, and Leese also does some string arrangements and some conducting. Band's rounded out by Mike DeRosier on drums and Steve Fosston on bass. There are 10 tracks on this album and all are original. 9 of them are written by the core songwriting team of the Wilson Sisters and Roger Fisher in various combinations. There is one group composition and that's the title track which opens side 2. The album was released on May 14, 1977. Barracuda is a huge hit. The album goes triple platinum, and so ultimately the Wilson Sisters had the last laugh on Siegel and Mushroom Records. Side 1 starts with Barracuda, and this is a song both in terms of feel and quality that you could comfortably file with The Immigrant Song, Communication Breakdown, or Paranoid. It's got superb, exciting drumming. It's got top-notch singing. Roger Fisher's guitar tone, I think, is the bomb.com. The whole thing, of course, was driven by that incident with the interviewer and the sisters' rage about the advertisement and just, frankly, about sleazy guys in the industry. And so this is basically their anti-misogyny manifesto, their Me Too song, and it still works today for that. That's followed by Love Alive, which is probably my favorite song on the album. I think this is a beautiful song. It's a complex song. It's got multiple different parts. It's a real triumph of songwriting. If you're a fan of guitar playing, this is a wonderful piece. It's got all kinds of killer riffs, none of which overstay their welcome. It's just enough of each little section. It's got light sections, it's got heavy sections, it's just laden with hooks. I think it's an amazing tune. And that's followed by a folky 1-2 punch, kind of a folky sweet 2-song Sylvan song, which basically is an instrumental which sort of leads into the next song, Dream of the Archer. This is basically a bit of a Zeppelin tribute, but it's shockingly well executed, and I've got no complaints. I love it. And it's one thing to idolize Zeppelin, it's another thing to actually pull off their shtick and do it well. The side concludes with Kick It Out. I think this is a really good rocker, but I always imagine it probably sounds better live than it did in the studio. I always think it sounds a little bit sterile. It just needs a bit more grit and a bit more sweat. But don't get me wrong, it's a great way to end the side. Side 2 starts with Little Queen, the title track, which, as I mentioned, is a group composition. This has got a whole bunch of different feels and textures to it. It actually has a really pretty funky riff. In fact, the whole song is almost a funk song. There are, of course, extended passages which are flat out rock, but then the middle section is kind of an extended bridge, which is actually their folky side, the one we heard on Sylvan's song, coming to the fore again. So a song where you really get a sense of the full range of this band. The next song, Treat Me Well, is a ballad which has Nancy singing lead. This is quite a heavily produced song in the end, not necessarily the beginning. By the end, Lisa's got the string section in, he's conducting that, there's some harmonica in there as well. It's quite a collective effort. Say Hello is a cheery, Caribbean-y, almost calypso-ish kind of a song, which is completely driven by the rhythm section, which I think is hugely underrated in general. People don't talk about them that much, but DeRosier and Fosston are a phenomenal rhythm section. They have so much range and so much capacity, and it shows all the way through this record. Anyway, they totally drive this song. As the song goes, it's maybe the weakest on the record, but technically the playing is very strong. The final 2 songs, Cry to Me and Go On Cry, form, if not a second suite, at least a bit of a medley because they're linked by this little gentle little guitar arpeggio. Cry to Me is a great ballad with a lovely empathic vocal by Anne. I almost think it has a bit of a country feel. Go On Cry, the closer, is an instrumental, and it harkens back actually to some of the concept-y soundscapes of their debut album, I think. I've seen some people call Go On Cry filler, but I actually think this works really well with the rest of the record. For the most part, these guys tended to resist the urge, which was quite common in the 70s, to do these extended jams. Instead, they wrote tight pop rock songs where the hooks never really outstayed their welcome, so every now and then a bit of self-indulgence is probably excusable. The song also gets a bit prog rocky in the middle section, once again showing off the skills of DeRosier and Fosston, a really great rhythm section, one with chops, and this is a sophisticated piece of songwriting all in all. Everything this record sets out to do, it does pretty well. It doesn't quite reach the emotional peaks of some parts of Dreamboat Annie. It probably has more good songs and almost no weak moments. As I mentioned, there were many bands at the time that idolized Zeppelin, but there weren't too many that had both the gall and the skills to scale those same heights, and I don't think it's accidental. The Zeppelin were big fans of Heart. This is, as I mentioned, a great sounding record, so kudos to Mike Flicker. It's got a huge dynamic range, and rock and folk are really pleasingly combined. I feel this is the band's best record of all. They would, of course, do a lot better commercially in the mid-1980s, and I don't want to put down that era for being commercially successful. Lots of people like it. This is something different. This is analog, tube amp, original issue Heart, and this is the record I find myself coming back to time and time again. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.